Hi, I'm Dr. Rodgir Cohen. I'm here today to talk about Chapter 4 of our textbook. We're going to talk about federalism, one of our most important theories that go into understanding how our government works. So, federalism is a question that we need to kind of flesh out with a question to start with. So, if you ever needed to get an abortion today, you can get one legally where you live, can you? Maybe yes in California. Can you carry a gun without a permit? No. Can you buy recreational marijuana? Yes. Can you vote using only a student ID? We'll see. The answer of all these questions depends not just on federal law, but on which state you live in. And since 2022, the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision returned abortion policy back to the states. The gap between the states on those questions has become a chasm, and a woman in California and a woman in Texas live in fundamentally different legal environments regarding reproductive health care. A gun owner in Texas and one in New York lived under dramatically different rules. This is federalism in action, and whether you think it's working well or a catastrophe depends on which state you live in and your view on those issues. Federalism is a constitutional division of power between the national government and the states. It's not a natural feature of government. Most democracies don't have it. The United States chose it in 1787 for specific historical and political reasons. We're going to look at some of these reasons through our 5 different learning objectives that you see on the screen. We're going to define federalism and contrast it with unitary systems and confederal systems. We're going to explain Madison's rationale for federalism in Federalist 10, 39, and 51, trace the evolution of American federalism from dual through cooperative and competitive. We're going to describe the Marshall Court and analyze federalism stress tests. The 3 systems on the left side represent fundamentally different answers to the question, where does sovereign authority ultimately reside? In a unitary system, sovereignty is indivisible and flows from the center. The United Kingdom, France, Japan, the vast majority of the world's democracies are unitary. Local and regional governments exist, but they are administrative consequences created by the national government. Parliament could legally abolish the Scottish Parliament tomorrow, though it could be politically catastrophic if they did so. There is no constitutional guarantee of subnational power. In a confederal system is the opposite. Subnational units retain ultimate sovereignty, and the national government is their agent. The United States from 1781 to 1789 operated under the Articles of Confederation, which were confederal arrangements. Congress could request but not demand taxes, could not regulate commerce, had no executive or no courts, and depended entirely on the state cooperation to function. It didn't work. The Confederate States of America also had a confederal constitution, which contributed to the South's inability to mobilize the economy efficiently for war. Each state jealously guarded its sovereignty against the Confederate central government. Federalism splits the difference, for sovereignty is constitutionally divided between 2 levels, each with guaranteed authority in its own sphere. The national government cannot abolish the states cannot nullify federal law. Each level is supreme within the sphere, and the Constitution defines incompletely where those and spheres are. There are key constitutional provisions. One is the Supremacy Clause. That's Article 6 is the essential provision. The Constitution and laws made under it are the supreme law of the land, and state judges are bound by it, notwithstanding anything in the state constitutions or laws contrary. This resolves the most basic conflict. When valid federal law and state law conflict, federal law always wins. The question is always whether the federal law is in fact under the Constitution. Then concurrent powers are those powers that are shared by both levels of government, federal and state. That's taxation, criminal law, healthcare regulation, transportation. Both Congress and state legislators can tax. Both federal and state governments have criminal codes. The overlap creates a complexity, and sometimes they conflict, but it also creates a redundancy. If the federal government abandons a regulatory space, states fill it and bring in their views. The laboratories of democracy concept comes from Justice Brandeis's dissent in 1932 case. He wrote that a single courageous state may, if citizens choose, serve as the laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without the risk of the rest of the country. Massachusetts enacted healthcare reform under Governor Romney in 2006. It became the model for the ACA. Colorado re-legalized recreational marijuana in 2012. Many states followed. California set emission standards and become the de facto national standards. So these states all become laboratories under the Federalist idea. Madison's theory of federalism founded in Federalist Paper 10, and it had the faction problem. Federalist Paper 10 was published on November 22nd, 1787, and is arguably the most important document in American political science. Madison's question, how do you prevent factions, organized groups, from pursuing their own interests at the expense of the common good, from destroying our republican government? The British experience has shown that small republics were vulnerable to factional domination. The Greek city-states had all fallen to faction or tyranny, and Madison's answer was structural rather than moral. He did not expect citizens to be virtuous enough to subordinate their interests to the common good. Instead, he designed a system where diversity and scale made factional domination structurally difficult. In a small republic, a single faction could easily become the majority and use government to oppress the minority. In a large republic, stretching across a continent encompassing hundreds of distinct economic, religious, and regional interests, it was much harder for any single faction to assemble a stable majority. So factions would cancel each other out. This is a theoretical argument for the large republic, which connects directly to federalism, that the geographic scale of the federal union, combined with this diversity of state interests, provided a structural check on factional tyranny that small states operating alone could not achieve. And this extended republic was not just bigger, it was structurally safer for everyone. By 2026, you'll see on the side, it's important and worth noting that um, Madison's solution assumed that cutting factions, that your economic interests, religious identity, regional identity, and class would not align with the same partisan side, but geographic partisan sorting has produced what Liliana Manson calls mega identities. So by now, in today's times, we have in deep red rural districts and deep blue urban districts, party, race, religion, education, and geography all align, and factions are not canceling each other out. They are intensifying each other. Maxim's structural solution may be less effective when the geographic diversity of the extended republic has sorted into partisan blocks. So then we look at Federalist Paper 51, Ambition Counteracting Ambition. Federalist Paper 51 gives a famous phrase, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Madison's argument, you cannot rely on the virtue of officials to prevent abuse of power. You must design the institutional architect so that each institution has both the motive and the means to restrict encroachments by the others. Self-interest, properly channeled, produces accountability. Federal structure adds a second layer to this logic, state governments that check the federal government and vice versa. Citizens have two sets of constitutional protections against federal government and from the bill that are in the Bill of Rights, and against the state governments through state constitutions and the 14th Amendment. A tyrant would have to capture not just one government but dozens simultaneously in America in order to make change. We see that the way the United States funds right now are economic funds. It comes through things called grants. Categorical grants from the federal government come with string money attached. So money from the federal government given to the states will say, we'll give you this money, but you have to build a highway for it. Block grants are a different form of funding. They give money to states with more discretion, money for a broad purpose with fewer conditions. So temporary assistance for needy families would be a way to give money to people who need lower income grants. And then there are unfunded mandates that are happening and within the funding system of the Federalist system. That would be the federal government requires states to do something, but they don't attach money to it. So, like the Real ID, if you have a Real ID passport, you'll have to have that if you want to travel across state lines on an airplane now. American federalism has gone through different eras and iterations and development. First era was called dual federalism from 1790 to 1932. The original design, clear separation between federal and state spheres, with each level supreme to its own. It was like a layer of cake, a cake layer metaphor, and the distinct separate layers were not intermingled, and the federal government handles its enumerated powers that are in the Constitution, like commerce, defense, monetary policy, and the states handled everything else. Chief Justice Marshall's early decisions in the courts established federal supremacy decisively in McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, and that's the foundational case. Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States, and Maryland tried to tax it out of existence. Marshall's opinion established two critical principles. First, implied powers. Congress has the authority to use means not specifically listed in the Constitution. They're called implied powers if they are appropriate to carrying out the enumerated powers, so the things listed in the Constitution. Let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adopted to that end, which are not prohibited but consistent with the letter and the spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional, it reads. Second, the federal supremacy. States cannot use their taxing power to destroy any instrument of the federal government. The power to tax is the power to destroy. Federal institutions must be immune from state destruction. The second major case was called Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. It established broad federal authority over interstate commerce. New York had given a monopoly over steamboat navigation in its waters to Robert Livingston and Robert Fulton. Their licensee, Aaron Ogden, tried to block Thomas Gibbons, who held a federal license, from operating in the same waters. Marshall ruled for Gibbons that Congress's commerce power extends to all commercial intercourse between states, including navigation. This broad interpretation gave the Commerce Clause becomes the Constitution's foundation for virtually all modern federal regulation. The second area of cooperative federalism is called cooperative federalism. Went from 1933 to 1969. The Great Depression shattered dual federalism's framework, and the state governments could not cope with the economic catastrophe. Their budgets were too small, their authority too limited, their political will too constrained by business interests. FDR's New Deal created joint federal state programs. This was called the Marble Cake Model, where both levels shared responsibility, funding, and administration. Social Security, unemployment insurance, highway construction, all these things were structured with federal-state partnerships. The Great Society extended this further: Medicare and Medicaid, federal education funding. And by the end of the 1960s, after the Civil Rights Act, the distinction between federal and state policy domains had blurred beyond almost recognition in domestic affairs. The third era was called the New Federalism. It's from 1969 through 2009. Nixon and Reagan both ran against cooperative federalism. Revenue sharing, block grants, and welfare reform all aimed at giving states more discretion and reducing federal strings. The Rehnquist courts, Lopez 1995 and Morrison 2000 decisions limited the Commerce Clause for the first time since the New Deal, striking down federal laws that criminalize guns near schools and violence against women as exceeding the Commerce Power's authority. The constitutional pendulum was swinging back towards dual federalism. The fourth era was called competitive federalism, which goes from 2010 through now. It's the current era characterized by intense policy divisions between states, not state experimentation, and Brandeisian economic senses of trying to different approaches to shared problems, but red and blue states pursuing fundamentally incompatible visions of governance. So abortion rights, gun regulation, voting access, marijuana, all these things are between the different within different states, and we're calling this competitive federalism, as each state competes with others over how they want to execute laws within our land. So federalism is under stress always. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 exposed structural limitations of competitive federalism in managing public health emergencies with brutality and brutal clarity. The PPE bidding wars in the spring of 2020 were the most vivid illustrations. When the pandemic hit and personal protective equipment like masks, gloves, gowns, and ventilators was desperately scarce, every level of government tried to acquire what it could. State governments were bidding against other state governments, and they were bidding against the federal government, which was competing for the same supply chain. So in some cases, FEMA was reportedly outbidding state governments for equipment and redirecting it. The federal government using its financial power to override state acquisition efforts was occurring, and the result was higher prices, slower distribution, and maybe even deaths that happened. The CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan did inject federal money into state and local governments at unprecedented scale. $2.2 trillion and $1.9 trillion respectively, but this federal fiscal intervention came through legislative process and was delayed, contested, unevenly distributed. A unitary system with a single command could have responded faster and more consistently, and the lesson learned was some problems, pandemics, climate, national security, require a coordinated national response that competitive federalism structurally resists sometimes. So I'd like to thank you for tuning in to today's lecture.